Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the NAPABA Lobby Day webinar. We'll be starting in a minute to allow everyone to dial in. Again, if you have any issues with the webinar, please email Arya Joy Asaria. She's emailed you earlier with the information, and her contact information is in the earlier emails you received about the Lobby Day schedule. Good afternoon. Thank you all again for participating in NAPABA Lobby Day 2016. My name is Navdeep Singh. I'm the Policy Director here. I'm really excited to have you all join us in Washington. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to go over some of the issues that we'll be talking about in Washington with your members of Congress and senators. We'd like this to be an opportunity for you to get a basic understanding of the issues, so that way you're able to convey why they matter to you as a constituent and as a member of the APA legal community and a local bar association to your members' offices. This is a great opportunity for all of us to speak out on issues that are important to the Asian Pacific American community, as well as to push for changes that our community wants to see. So we'll move over to our agenda. We're going to go through with a quick overview of Lobby Day, and then I'm going to turn it over to our experts, the co-chairs of some of our NAPABA committees, who will be able to talk to you in more detail and prepare you for your visit. After that, we'll have a question and answer period, and then we'll go over a few logistical reminders. Next slide, please. So, as an overview of the schedule, this is how all the trainings fit together. We're here with the Issues Training webinar, where you'll learn about the issues as we discussed. And you'll receive, after this webinar, we will make a copy of the video available as well as the slides. And we will share with you briefing books with more detailed information about these bills, including the bill text, some bill summaries, as well as a list of sponsors, and materials that, such as NAPABA's policy resolutions and statements on the topics. We're going to have, when you come to DC, as you see on the 23rd, we're going to have another skills training and issue review where our experts will be there to answer some of your last-minute questions you have after going through the materials, and to make sure that you got a chance to review the talking points and the key points that you need to remember when you're there conducting your visits. Additionally, we'll also have some former Hill staff join us to help go through some scenarios, so that way you feel more comfortable when you're in your meeting. Of course, there is the optional Supreme Court tour and the congressional reception, which you can still register for on our website. You can invite others to register for them as well. The website is there at the bottom of the page, bit.ly/NAPABA Lobby Day 2016. All of you as webinar Lobby Day attendees are registered for the congressional reception. And then on Tuesday, you'll have another strategy session to meet with everyone before you go to your Hill meetings. The Hill meetings are still being scheduled, and as you are aware, if you've attended in the past, we have to be flexible because meeting times do change. Therefore, we will let you know your schedule the best that it is set when you come and see us in Washington. Now, the key thing to remember as you go through the training today and to get you in the right mindset for your trip to DC is that you do not have to be an expert and know every little footnote on every bill. The key here is that you remember the talking points and you remember how to relate it to why it's important to you as a constituent and you as a representative of the Asian Pacific American community. Because you are a constituent, your voice is important, and the fact that you are having this meeting is important. And that's what's going to convey the message across, your presence in the room. And so we'll turn over now to our experts, our committee chairs who were able to join us today. And today we're going to be hearing from our Immigration Committee co-chairs, Rio Guerrero and Erin Oshiro, one of our Civil Rights Committee co-chairs, Meredith Higashi, and one of our Judiciary and Nominations and Appointments Committee co-chairs, John Yang. So we'll move over to the next slide, because certainly as they go through their presentation, you may have some questions. We're going to save all of the questions and we're going to address them at the end of the webinar. But if you'd like to submit a question, as you can see there in the image, you have a questions box that's popped up in your GoToWebinar portal. Please use that to type in your questions. They'll appear on our back end and we'll be able to share them with everyone. Or if you have a problem with that, please email Arya Joy Asaria. She's running the webinar for us here. She's on our Policy and Programs Associate here on NAPABA staff, and she'll be able to share them with us as well. That way we can get them addressed either now or common questions come up, we can send them to you via email as well. Additionally, if you have any logistical questions about your trip to Washington, please email Arya. Thank you. Next slide, please. All right, so now it's time for the Fair Day in Court Act. We'll turn it over to Rio to go ahead, the co-chair of our Immigration Committee, to go ahead and get us started. Thank you, Rio.
Thanks, Navdeep. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. You know, I've been to NAPABA Lobby Day myself, though not last year, a couple of years ago, and it's always an exciting event, a lot of fun, and I'm very much looking forward to it for this year. So the Fair Day in Court Act, as an immigration practitioner, is going to be a very valuable piece of legislation that we're hoping that will be passed. If you could go to the next slide, please. So as you may know, and may be surprised to know, persons in deportation or removal proceedings are not appointed legal counsel. And as a practitioner, this is utterly amazing when you consider the complexity of U.S. immigration law and procedure and the possible outcomes such as deportation, separation from families, maybe persecution the person may face back in their home country, and maybe even death, all resulting probably from, possibly from a deportation proceeding. You know, the United States has a very proud history of giving refuge to vulnerable populations, and you probably have seen it in the news over the last 2 years. I think it's impossible to have missed it, which is the influx of refugees and other immigrants across our southern border. And this really obviously brought the topic to the news and to the head and everyone's daily conversation about you know, what's going on and what to do about this influx of immigrants. But at the heart of that, you're also seeing images of families, individuals, children, and even infants crossing the border. And I'll tell you that oftentimes these, especially the younger persons, are coming by themselves, unaccompanied, and having to face deportation proceedings without counsel. And so, if we could go to the next slide. This has been a problem not just over the last few years, but you know, as practitioners, this is something we've always lamented, that you know, there are people in deportation proceedings who do not have access to counsel, who certainly need counsel. And you think about that these are foreign nationals who are coming from countries where English is not their first language. They may be very intimidated by the judicial system or even distrustful of the judicial system here in the United States because of maybe their experience in their home country. And now they're being forced to defend themselves in a deportation proceeding, and many of them could be infants, children, and other vulnerable individuals. So this legislation, first of all, clarifies that the Attorney General does in fact have the ability to appoint or provide counsel to immigrants who are in removal proceedings. It also requires that the Department of Homeland Security provides the relevant charging documents and information to the immigrant who is in deportation proceedings. You'll be surprised that so many people in deportation proceedings are never even given the charging documents or even understand the facts being alleged against them. It also gives the Department of Homeland Security, also gives them the obligation that they must provide immigrants who are in detention or at border facilities access to counsel, which is always a problem because there are things such as expedited removal proceedings that go on at the border, and for persons who are in detention who never have an opportunity or even never given an opportunity to communicate with counsel. And then maybe one of the most important parts of this new legislation is that unaccompanied children and other vulnerable individuals, such as people who have disabilities, people who are victims of abuse, torture, or violence, have the right to be appointed counsel by the government. And this is something certainly new, something very much welcome in this legislation. If you could go to the next slide, please. Also in this legislation, the pilot programs for legal orientation for persons who are in detention will be created. And this will give people who are in detention an overview of what they should expect and what their rights may be and defenses may be. And then, of course, again, they will be given access to counsel. Also, there will be a case management pilot project created to measure whether or not the individuals who are involved in the LOT program and those individuals who are taking advantage of access to counsel or appointed counsel, how those appearance rates are going and how those cases are progressing. And ultimately, yes, DHS needs to submit reports to Congress about how these programs are working, if they are in fact benefiting, so that they can be expanded nationwide. If you go to the next slide, please. So, as Navdeep said, there's no need to be a subject matter expert when you go on lobby day and speak to your congressperson. It's important just to really hit home the themes. And I think what's really important here is to understand that, is that people are in deportation proceedings who have no ability to really defend themselves and are really lost in the system. And this really flies in the face of our ideas of fairness and justice and due process in our court system, because the immigration system is just far too complex and the stakes are too high for foreign nationals who are faced with deportation and, as I said, the potential outcomes of separation from family and maybe persecution and maybe even death when they return to their home countries. So with that, on the next slide, we would ask you to obviously ask your congresspersons to sponsor and champion the bill and promote others to do so, support that there be a hearing on the bill, and ultimately to vote in favor of the bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rio. We'll move over to the next section. And again, as a reminder, if you have any questions about any of the topics we cover, please feel free to ask them in our question answer section of your webinar. I'd now like to introduce Meredith Higashi, who many of you know, the co-chair of our Civil Rights Committee, to talk about the resolution on the Day of Remembrance. Meredith?
Hi everyone, thank you Navdeep, and thank you to the NAPABA staff for organizing this training. So I'll be focusing on Senate Resolution 373, which was introduced by Senator Mazie Hirono in February. You can go to the next slide. This resolution was introduced to commemorate the Day of Remembrance that is widely honored throughout communities across the country that month to reflect on the Japanese American incarceration during World War II. So there are two key components of the resolution. The first recognizes the historical significance of Executive Order 9066, which was the order that was signed that led to the incarceration. And the second component is to express the sense of the Senate that policies that discriminate against individuals based on real or perceived race, ethnicity, national origin, or religion would be a repetition of the historical wrongdoing of EO 9066 and are contrary to the values of the United States. Next slide. So I know many of you are already quite familiar with the historical background of 9066, but just as a refresher, the order was signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt on February 19, 1942, 10 weeks after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and amidst mass war hysteria, fear, suspicion, and racial prejudice. On the grounds of military necessity, this order authorized the Secretary of War to prescribe areas from which any or all persons could be excluded. And this power was used to exclude all 120,000 U.S. citizens and permanent residents of Japanese ancestry from their homes on the West Coast, and then remove them during the war to various government mass incarceration camps. There's a little map on your slide that shows the exclusion zone and the location of various camps, which I think in addition to personal connections that some of you may have to the incarceration, some of you could also find relevant in discussing connections in your states and regions. Next slide. So remembering 9066 is not only significant historically because of the deprivation of rights, liberties, and freedoms of Japanese Americans that it authorized, but because of the widespread recognition of the wrongfulness of the incarceration. So a few examples: in 1976, on the anniversary of 9066, President Ford formally rescinded the order with a presidential proclamation. Then in 1983, a federal bipartisan committee that was directed by Congress to review the facts and circumstances surrounding the incarceration issued its report that concluded that 9066 was unjustified and shaped by race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. In 1988, President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act into law, which formally apologized for the fundamental deprivation of civil liberties and constitutional rights of those incarcerated and provided reparations to survivors. And then most recently, just a few years ago, Acting Solicitor U.S. General Neil Katyal issued a statement recognizing the error of the Solicitor General's office in not disclosing key information that it had that undermined the rationale of the incarceration to the U.S. Supreme Court, which had upheld the incarceration in the famous case Korematsu v. U.S. Next slide. So the event of the Japanese American incarceration and the recognition of its mistakes in the decades since are important for us to remember as a national community, particularly because the themes and experiences that shape that dark chapter in U.S. history haven't been isolated to that time. In particular, this resolution, 373, addresses parallels that have been particularly stark in the post-9/11 public and political environment. Hate crimes, xenophobia, and bigotry against Arab, Middle Eastern, South Asian, Muslim, Sikh, and Hindu American communities are all too prevalent, from attacks on places of worship to individualized targeting and racial profiling. And we saw in the aftermath of 9/11, and again after more recent terrorist attacks such as those in Paris and Brussels, the rise in inflammatory rhetoric and proposals for discriminatory policies by both members of the public and by lawmakers and public figures. These include calls for mandatory registration of Muslims in the United States and bans on immigration from certain countries or regions. And the connection of the scapegoating and fear and suspicion of certain communities from the Japanese American experience during World War II to now has even been made explicit. For example, you'll remember last year the mayor of Roanoke, Virginia invoked the Japanese American incarceration as justification for suspending assistance to Syrian refugees in his city, and that was a call to which NAPABA very publicly denounced. Next slide. So as we meet with Senate offices to expand support for Senate Resolution 373, there are a few key messaging themes we want to convey. One is to recognize the historical significance of 90666 by discussing the Day of Remembrance as an opportunity to educate about a part of history that is still really unfamiliar to many, and to honor the lessons learned. And more broadly, to connect those themes and those lessons to the context of current issues affecting immigrant and minority communities, to show why the ongoing vigilance against repeating mistakes of the past is so critical. Some of these messaging themes, I think, are ones that apply beyond just this resolution and are part of the broader framework that we want to use when discussing why all of these various bills are so important to us as members of the APA community. And that is that America is a diverse country, and communities of all backgrounds have made positive contributions. Second is that responding to certain events by contributing to or not aggressively denouncing a climate of hate, xenophobia, and bigotry is contrary to American values. And then there are some messages that are particularly important for us to convey as members of the legal community, that policies that discriminate based on race, ethnicity, religion, or national origin repeat mistakes of the past that have been widely condemned and deemed unjust, and that it is in times of crisis when we most need to stand strong to our commitment to upholding justice and civil liberties for all people. Next slide. So our goal on Lobby Day is to help influence a majority of senators to support the resolution for it to pass. Currently there are 27 Democrats and 1 independent as sponsors, and our ask is simple: to sponsor S-Res 373. And if your senator has already sponsored the resolution, to thank them for their support. Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith. And now we'll move over to the anti-refugee legislation that we've been seeing come across the Hill, very much related to the message that Senator Hirono has put in her Day of Remembrance resolution, as Meredith just shared. So I'll turn the phone over now to Erin Oshiro, co-chair of our Immigration Committee.
Hi,
and I would like to say one of my residents and go-to experts and mentors on all things immigration.
Thank you, Navdeep. That's a very kind introduction. And I think you're right. I think what we've seen on kind of the anti-refugee front is sort of the other side of what Meredith and even Rio have been discussing. So next slide. So I think it's no surprise to folks on this call that the past few years there has been kind of an explosion in the refugee crisis around the world. We would most often hear about Syrian refugees, which have been sort of most noticeable in the news this past year or more. But according to the UN, there are currently 60 million people displaced around the world. This is unprecedented numbers. It may be difficult to see on the slide, but what I found was a list of the top 16 countries of origin for refugees. Syria is at 4 million, Afghanistan is at 2.5, Somalia at 1.1, but even other Asian countries, that we might kind of put into the APA space, Myanmar, Burma at 479,000, Vietnam at 313,000. These are large numbers, and so they are impacting our community as well as others. And before I move into this further, I just wanted to define, who is a refugee? What are we, who are we talking about here? And under the law, a refugee is a person who is outside his or her country and who is unable or unwilling to return because of persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution on account of their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. So this is a very specific definition. So sometimes you'll see in the news, they talk about refugees versus economic migrants. So refugees are a very specific, defined set of people and are not individuals who might be moving, simply because of, seeking a better, kind of economic opportunity for their families. And the majority of refugees right now around the world are women and children. Next slide, please. So, we've seen in the news a lot about, the response in Europe to the refugee crisis, since so many refugees are finding their way to Europe. But what's been happening here in the U.S.? Well, along the lines of what Meredith mentioned, since last summer, some members of Congress and through the fall, have been using tragedies around the world to either limit or otherwise restrict refugee admissions to the United States. Certainly, the tragedy in Paris was kind of a lightning rod. And at one point, we saw 31 states who were refusing to resettle refugees in their states, 31 governors refusing to resettle refugees in their states, or otherwise creating kind of hostile environments for refugees who were in the U.S. And mostly these attacks were targeting Syrian refugees, the majority of whom are Muslims. The rhetoric was really about alleged security concerns, but under existing law, states actually lack the authority to refuse resettlement. So it was sort of much ado about nothing. The U.S. actually only admits a relatively small number of refugees, certainly in comparison to other countries. In fiscal year 2015, we admitted just under 70,000. We might compare that to Germany, which is expected to welcome 1 million refugees in 2015. The U.S. has committed to admitting more refugees. This year it will be about 85,000 and then up to 100,000 in 2017. But compared to kind of the worldwide population, it's a very small number, and we're very selective in who we choose to admit. So I think a lot of us were concerned that the legislation we've seen coming out at the federal level and even the state level, might be just kind of a proxy for discrimination, unfortunately. Next slide, please. So I want to just talk about two bills. There have been some other bills introduced, but there's just two in particular that I wanted to highlight for today's purposes. So one is it's called the American Security Against Foreign Enemies, or SAFE Act, H.R. 4038. So this bill was very specifically targeted at refugees coming from Iraq and Syria, the majority of whom are Muslims. This bill would have introduced, or would introduce, lots of additional layers of security and review measures, which would essentially halt refugees from Iraq and Syria. We already have a very kind of extensive and rigorous vetting process for refugees that takes about 18 to 24 months before people even get to the U.S. It's very extensive: background checks, security checks, interview process, biometrics, kind of all the things you might imagine. It's a lengthy process. And so this bill would have made it even more difficult for people to come here, and only from Iraq and Syria. The bill actually already passed the House last November, and then it was stopped in the Senate after a procedural vote failed. So, one of our concerns is that, this bill might advance again, and we'll kind of get to the asks in another slide or so. Next slide, please. So the other bill that's been introduced, and I've seen some movement, is the Refugee Program Integrity Restoration Act, or H.R. 4731. So this legislation would actually sort of overhaul our refugee system a little bit more. It would cap annual refugee admissions at 60,000 and would take away the power from the president to set that number. He would have to recommend a different number to Congress and then be approved by Congress. Right now, the president has the power to set the number of refugees admitted. It would actually, for the first time, require the U.S. to prioritize admitting refugees who are religious minorities. There has been some talk or rhetoric from some members of Congress that we should be admitting more refugees who are Christians, even, the majority of people from some of these countries are Muslim, and that's just a fact. So it would be kind of prioritizing certain religious minorities over others, which has never been done before, and is really concerning. It would also allow states and localities to refuse to resettle refugees. We've already sort of seen that kind of negative impetus and intention on the parts of states. This would be really a significant change and not for the better. And like the other bill, it would also put just in addition additional expensive bureaucratic measures. It would subject refugees to ongoing surveillance until they become legal permanent residents, which is a period of 3 years. So there's lots of kind of concerns about this bill, and there have been no particularized threats from refugees, who have been admitted to the U.S. So it's not clear that any of these things would make us safer, and really seem to just be kind of knee-jerk reactions. This bill has already passed out of the House Judiciary Committee just almost 2 months ago. So it hasn't moved since then, but there's always the concern that these proposals could get steam. Next slide, please. So when you're thinking about your visits and what you might want to talk about, we just want to think about why is this important to our community, and why does NAPABA care about this? And I included here some images of the boat people fleeing Southeast Asia in the 70s and the early 80s. And I think you might see some of these images. They really are the same as that we're seeing now of people, in the Mediterranean, and the tragedies that are occurring there with families risking their lives at sea in dangerous, dinghies and rafts and boats, trying to get their families to safety. So, this is something that resonates with our community because of our own experience. Many Asian Americans came and continue to come to the U.S. as refugees. Obviously, there was Vietnam and other Southeast Asian countries in the 70s and 80s, and really that refugee wave was the largest we've actually ever seen in the U.S. Between 76 and 2006, over 1.3 million East Asian refugees came to the U.S. In more recent years, Burma and Bhutan have made up significant numbers of refugees admitted to the U.S. For example, in 2011 and 2012, nearly half of the refugees who came to the U.S. were from Burma and Bhutan. So this is something that is connected to our own history. And then as NAPABA members and as attorneys, we have a commitment to civil rights and to anti-discrimination. So proposals that are explicitly discriminatory on national origin or religion or race, or even more that are more kind of insidious, those are really antithetical to what we fight for as attorneys and members of NAPABA. Next slide. So some of the key messages you might want to share in your visits, have to do with the fact that we can care about security and public safety, but we can also balance that with strong humanitarian relief. We don't have to have just one or the other. We have strong measures in place now to protect the public and to vet refugees before they come here, and we can do that while keeping in mind that we want to provide relief to as many people as possible. Some of the things that we have been supporting as NAPABA, and you might want to include when you're talking in your visits, is we want to support measures to increase the number of refugees resettled in the U.S. So we definitely don't want bills that would restrict or further restrict refugee admissions to the U.S. We also want to increase and improve programs and services for refugees once they are here in the U.S. Many of these individuals are coming here, traumatized by what they've experienced in their home countries. They may have mental health issues, physical issues that they're dealing with. Many of them come here without much in the way of economic resources. And refugees are expected to kind of stand up on their own 2 feet very quickly. The refugee period is very short, and when they're getting assistance from the federal government. So we actually would like to see that lengthened or increased, or more services provided to these community members so that they can be more productive and have a more successful outcome. And then the last thing is, we really want to condemn federal, state, or other, initiatives that would restrict refugee resettlement or deny services and programs, specifically or especially based on national origin, race, ethnicity, or religion. We know for our own community we are very diverse. We come from a number of different countries and backgrounds, and so any proposals that seem discriminatory or would have the effect of being discriminatory, are very sort of counter to what we believe in and kind of our position. So we would want to strongly condemn those measures. Should I just go on, Navdeep, to the next section?
Yes, we'll just stay with Erin for our next slide, please, and our next topic, which is the Reuniting Families Act, HR 4798.
Okay, thank you, Navdeep. So changing gears here a little bit, but also an important immigration issue, I wanted to talk about the Reuniting Families Act. Next slide, please. So I think many of you probably know, and certainly if you've participated in NAPABA lobby days in the recent past, family reunification is a really important issue in the immigration debate for Asian Pacific Americans as well as other immigrants and their families. It's been a cornerstone of our immigration policy since 1965, when kind of our current system was put in place, and it has just been a key way for immigrant communities, particularly APIs, to bring their families here and to start new lives in the U.S. So the problem with our immigration system, as many of you know, is that there are not enough visas to go around. There are a limited number of visas every year for people coming here either as family members or on permanent employment visas. And right now on the family side, there are 4.2 million family members waiting, quote unquote, in line for a visa. This means they are waiting for their chance to come here with their papers in hand. There are, of that number, about 1.8 million are Asian nationals who are waiting abroad to come here. And people will wait anywhere from 3 years, kind of at the quick end, if you're maybe the the wife of a green card holder, to 25 years if you are the sibling of a U.S. citizen and you're waiting in the Philippines. So the waits can be very long, and you can imagine all of the hardships that families endure while they're waiting for their loved ones to come here. So let's see. Right now, there's a graph here which is a little bit hard to see maybe, but Asian countries make up 41% of the backlog. So we are approaching half of the backlog, but in the U.S. we're only between 6 and 7% of the population, so it sort of had a disproportionate impact on our community in particular. And the countries with the biggest waits are for Asia are the Philippines, Vietnam, China, India are the countries that have the longest waits and the largest backlogs. Next slide, please. Okay. So Reuniting Families Act, or RFA, is a bill that's been introduced a couple of times now on the House side. There used to be a Senate companion bill introduced by Senator Menendez, but there isn't one currently. So this is an issue that Representative Mike Honda from California has championed for many years. Really, it's actually the API members of Congress who have fought the hardest for family reunification and have really, kind of done the most to elevate this issue within our community and within kind of the broader immigration reform movement. So it's really to their credit that they continue to prioritize this issue. So what does RFA do? A lot of the changes are very technical, and you don't need to go into the weeds on that, or some of that will be included in your briefing books. But really, the main purpose of RFA is to reduce the existing backlog, those 4.2 million people that I talked about, and get them here more quickly, and then also to put in place changes that would prevent the backlog from building up again in the future. So some of these things would be recapturing immigrant visas. So this is kind of this idea of every year a small number of visas are lost kind of to bureaucracy, and what we want to do is sort of look back at all the visas that we were supposed to have but that were never issued and recapture them so we can use them as they were intended. It would also reclassify some immigrants into a different category so that they would not be subject to numerical limits, which would help them be able to come here more quickly. So what RFA would do is would treat the spouses and minor children of green card holders the same way that we treat the spouses and minor children of U.S. citizens. The idea being that these are the same family members, they're similarly situated, and they should be able to reunite more quickly. It would increase per country limits, which again would help reduce the existing backlog and prevent a backlog in the future. Right now, each country is subject to a per country limit that is regardless of the size of the backlog or the demand for visas in a particular country. Everyone is subject to the same per country limit, which really it doesn't make any sense when you think about the demand for visas from some countries is much larger than from other countries. RFA would keep the per country limits the same for every country, but it would be increased for all countries. It would provide some relief for families of veterans from the Philippines in particular. And I think maybe, I don't know if Rio will touch upon that or not, but family members for veterans who fought on behalf of the U.S. during World War II have some of the longest wait times for any immigrants, despite their service and their courage on behalf of the U.S. So it would create a specific exemption for family members of those veterans. And also the last thing, the last kind of major thing that RFA would do would be to increase equality for LGBT families. So up until a few years ago, before the U.S. Supreme Court decision in the Windsor case, same-sex couples, married couples, were not recognized by our immigration system. So they couldn't sponsor family members of spouse the same way opposite-sex couples can. The Supreme Court changed some of that with the Windsor decision, but there are additional changes that need to be put in place so that there's kind of complete equality for LGBT families in our immigration system. And then the next slide, please. So the last thing, just sort of, again, some key messages and the asks, is that to emphasize that family unity is important to all Americans. This is not just something that, APIs care about or immigrants. This is something that all families in America can relate to, and we understand how important family is to our kind of emotional, economic, and, mental well-being. We know that family members are important contributors to our communities and our economy. This is an important point to try to cover because people who come to the U.S. on family-based visas are often criticized as being low or unskilled workers, and it simply isn't the case. Immigrants who come to the U.S. as family members have varying levels of education and play important roles, up and down our kind of economic spectrum. They are entrepreneurs who start our mom and pop restaurants and dry cleaners, and all of the kind of small businesses that we see. They support other family members so they can work by providing child care or elder care. They pool resources to support one another economically. And most of all, we know that they're highly motivated, right? They're giving up everything they know in their home country to come here without a job. And so they're really motivated to, to do well economically and to be successful for their loved ones. So it's just kind of important to note that family members are important to our immigration system and to our economy, and shouldn't kind of be cast aside in support of other visas, particularly employment visas. So some of the asks are to co-sponsor the bill. Right now there are 81 co-sponsors on the House, and all of them are Democrats. There has never been a Republican co-sponsor for this bill. And although we are nonpartisan, and it could be good to just encourage those members, particularly who have large API numbers in their districts, to support this bill and to get on board. And then the other thing is they can hold a hearing. The Judiciary Committee in the House should look at these issues and take them seriously, and they could have a hearing on this bill. So that's another ask that you can raise during your meetings. And if it's a co-sponsor of the bill, then of course always remember to thank them. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. And as a reminder, please feel free to submit questions. Thank you to all of those who have thus far. And now I'd like to turn the floor back to Rio to talk about an issue that he's been working on for a long time and I'd like to thank him for all of his leadership.
Well, thank you, Navdeep. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Filipino Veterans Congressional Gold Medal Act, S1555 and HR 2737. If you go to the next slide, please. So the background on this bill really is that for those who may know, the Filipino soldiers during World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued a military order in 1941 directing them to come under the command of the U.S. Armed Forces in the Far East to defend the Philippines and the United States. And 260,000 Filipino soldiers answered that call. And of that, 57,000 roughly died in uniform fighting for the U.S. and the Philippines. It's obviously a very long time ago now, but still remaining there are roughly 16,000 to 18,000 soldiers, Filipino-American soldiers in the United States and in the Philippines. And their average ages today are 92 to 97 years old. If you go to the next slide, please. So the bill is seeking a congressional gold medal for these Filipino veterans. And I have been involved with this recently, but this goes back 74 years. The Filipinos have been seeking benefits for many years since World War II, and this Congressional Gold Medal has been something they've sought certainly over the last several decades. It's important to note that the bills do not contain any language or references to veterans' benefits or issues on immigration. As Erin had said before in her talk, there are separate legislation seeking that type of benefit. This bill simply seeks the Congressional Gold Medal, and I think it's important to make that note when you are speaking at Lobby Day, because you know, this should not be lumped into anything political with respect to immigration rights. On top of that, you know, the benefits that the Filipinos have sought, there have been some granted to them in the last several years. There was a one-time lump sum payment of $15,000 to U.S.-based veterans and $9,000 to Philippine-based Filipino veterans. And this was a payment for their services rendered. And that's separate from this. So if there's any discussion about, well, what are we really seeking here? It is the Congressional Medal. It is recognition for the service that all of these veterans gave during World War II. It's also important to note that really the Filipino veterans of World War II, they're the last minority veterans group to not yet be recognized by Congress. And what I mean by that is, bear in mind that certain World War II veterans groups have already received Congressional Gold Medals, and you're familiar with them. It's the Navajo Code Talkers in 2000, the Tuskegee Airmen in 2006, Native American Code Talkers in 2008, Women Air Force Air Service Pilots in 2009, and the list goes on. And another point here is, you know, Congressional Gold Medals are granted with some frequency. And in fact, in 2014, there were 6 Congressional Gold Medals given out, and one was to the 65th Infantry Regiment of Puerto Rico, the American Fighter Aces in 2014, also in the Doolittle Tokyo Raiders, and others, the monuments, the monument men of World War II. All of these, there were 6 Congressional Gold Medal groups in 2014 alone. So there's certainly what we're seeking here. There's great precedent for it. Is something that is given out by the government. If we can go to the next slide, please. And so when you're speaking to you know, a congressperson or their staff, I would stress the fact that, yes, Filipino American war veterans of World War II, they've proven their honor, their service to the country so many years ago. Over 260,000 fought, nearly 60,000 died. And now, with a dwindling population of only 16,000 or 18,000 left, all of them with an average age of 92 years old to 97, this is maybe our last best chance to really give you know, our recognition to them, thank them for their service and what they've done for the country. Thank you.
We'll jump to the next slide, please. Yes, so as Rio said, and similar to Meredith's presentation, this is a case where we need a majority of both houses to sign on to sponsor this bill to ensure its passage. As you can see, we're close in the Senate. We're close in the Senate, but need a lot more help in the House. And a lot of times in these resolutions, it's a question of awareness as opposed to particularized opposition.
Right, I'm sorry, Navdeep, I cut off a little early before my last slide. I did want to say on this last numbers here, current numbers are actually 51 in the Senate and 95 in the House. But what we're really seeking here is 67 in the Senate and 218 in the House, really to show broad support for the bill and hopefully get unanimous consent and get it passed this year, well before there's a new president in place in January. So this is, we believe, really our last best chance during this Congress.
Yes, thank you, Rio. And now we'll turn over to John Yang, co-chair of our Judiciary and Executive Nominations and Appointments Committee, to talk about something which every one on this call is aware of and wants to see more of: Asian Pacific Islander American judicial nominees and judges. Thank you, John.
Great. Thank you, Navdeep. Good afternoon, all. And this issue, I think everyone knows, it's very straightforward. The basic message is confirm our judges. Why is that important? I mean, I think sort of, obviously we've made a lot of progress in the last 10 years. That said, if you look at our numbers, we have 4 circuit court judges, federal appellate court judges, 21 federal district court judges. If the number of Asian American judges reflected the Asian American population in the United States, we would have double both of those numbers. We should have about 10 to 11 circuit court judges, somewhere between 40 to 45 district court judges. So although we are making progress, there is still quite a bit to be done. As you will see from the slide, we have 5 judges that are awaiting confirmation right now, and you can see where they are lined up. The U.S. Court of International Trade sits in New York, but it is sort of similar to the Federal Circuit or the Court of Claims. It's a court of specific jurisdiction. And all of the other ones, you know, the key here is, number one, what we're targeting, obviously, are as members of the Senate, because the Senate controls the confirmations. And number 2, to the extent that you have meetings with either members of the Senate Judiciary Committee or specific senators from any of these states in question. You know, California, Texas, Colorado, D.C. unfortunately sort of is in the netherworld. Those make a difference. In particular, I would say, and this will probably be in your background book, even though sort of in some cases there aren't people from these states, certain states will be important, those battleground states. Particularly, I think Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Illinois. There are 4 Republican senators that are up for re-election in these states, and frankly, if sort of they are interested in showing bipartisanship, this is an area in which they can do it. If we go to the next slide, with respect to key messaging, again, it's pretty straightforward. You know, we've made progress, but there is progress to be done. The other key message here is that these are all judges that have bipartisan support, strong bipartisan support. Even for someone like Lucy Cole, who is in California, former Governor Schwarzenegger, former Governor Wells, so these are not, these are people that are well within the already have people on record supporting them from both sides of the aisle. Message that judicial nominations work in the press, especially in the context of the Merrick Garland nomination, various reports about what should be done in an election year. Setting aside the Supreme Court, obviously we don't have a Supreme Court nominee, very unfortunate, different discussion for time, but with respect to the current nominees that are before the Senate, progress has been made in an election year. During 2008, when President Bush was in his second term in the final year, there were actually, I believe, about 26 judges that were confirmed. Oh, here we have it, 28 judges that were confirmed, 23 after Memorial Day. So the notion that judicial confirmation shuts down completely is just inaccurate. And these 23 judges, admittedly, they were all so-called special circumstances. They were circumstances where there was bipartisan support. And in this particular case, with all of our nominees, we have bipartisan support. To date, in 2016, there have only been 6 confirmations. So we are far afield of the pace of 28 that was set by President George W. Bush in 2008. Even in the last 2 years combined, there have only been 17 confirmations total. So the Senate legitimately does have some work that it can do, that it should do, and that's the message that we would want to get out during these meetings. Thank you.
Yes, and to go to the next slide to review the goals and ask you. And please do submit your questions.
Right. Obviously, sort of the goal and the ask is very straightforward. They should confirm our judges. With respect to Jennifer Cho Groves, she is already before the Senate floor, so she just needs to be scheduled for a vote and voted. With respect to Lucy, Karen, Florence, and Gina, they still need to get through committee hearings. And currently, we believe that there will still be at least a couple more hearings that will take place. So it's a question of getting them on the calendar, and it's a question of making sure that both sides commit to having some more hearings.
All right. Thank you, John, for all of that. And thank you for all the work you and the committee have been doing on helping everyone get through this nominations process. We'll now move to our question and answer period. And again, please do submit them through the question box, or if you have any other logistical questions, do email them to Arya Joy Asaria. They're at asaria@napaba.org. I'll start off with the first question for, I'll point this to the Immigration Committee, Erin and Rio. Have there been any cost estimates of the Fair Day in Court Act?
Well, I have not seen any. I'm not aware if Erin has, but I have not seen any projected costs so far.
No, this is Erin. I'm not aware that the bill has been scored, but you know, Navdeep, it might be possible to follow up with Senator Reid's office.
Yes, we certainly will. And then there's another question for our Immigration Committee. Granted, we had a number of immigration topics this year in Lobby Day. That question is, how many APAs is there a number on how many Asian Pacific Americans are affected by lack of counsel in pending removal proceedings? And does DHS keep a count of that number, or by state data on the number of potential Asian Pacific American deportees?
Well, yeah, the Immigration Service does not keep track state by state deportations. I believe we probably could get a number of how many people are removed to which countries. I don't have that in front of me now, but they also, you know, they don't keep track of how many, or at least I'm not aware of them keeping any track of any public information that would say who is removed that was pro se.
Yeah, Navdeep, this is Erin. I would say the same thing, right? And just to echo what Rio said, I mean, DHS does keep track of and publish data on, you know, the countries of origins for people who are removed. So that's data we could find and perhaps be included in the briefing books. And you know, in terms of pro se, I don't know that there probably are not estimates, you know, by state or national origin, but we might be able to obtain just kind of general estimates for how many people are not represented, which wouldn't get, you know, to kind of ethnic specific or state specific, but it might just be a helpful piece of information to have.
Yes, we can certainly get that and try to get that information for everyone. There's another question: is who will pay for immigration counsel for unrepresented cases?
Right, and I guess that's the question with respect to their budget for the bill. I mean, you know, as Erin said, I'm not aware of what those costs would be, and I don't know. Again, I'm not aware that those numbers have been put forth yet.
Yes, at this time I have not seen, this is Navdeep here, I've not seen a score that the bill has been scored by the Congressional Budget Office yet, and we can certainly follow up to see if that is there. The bill does say that DHS has the power to appoint counsel. There's another question that's come in is, oh yes, can we get a list of sponsors for each of the bills? Yes, we will be including that information as up to date as we can have it in your briefing books. And for those of you who were unable to join us at the beginning, we will be sharing briefing books based off of some of the additional questions you've had following the call when we share the information about the webinar, etc., or with the recording, etc. We will also be sure to share specific profiles and position statements on where your members stand when you come to Washington. We'd like to set those up when we've got a better sense of the most likely schedule. As you know, offices often change meetings on us at the last minute. So we'd like to make sure you guys have the most accurate information possible. Are there any other questions, or we will close the webinar? Okay, I don't see any other questions coming through. So I would like to thank everyone for joining us. And if you do have any follow-up questions, please go ahead and email them to Aria Ajoy. She will be able to help you with any questions that you have. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing all of you here in Washington. Goodbye.